I'm Jess, and it's so great to be with you for a few moments today. Welcome to Kingston Standard Church, our online version. I'd love to invite you to connect with us online or in person. If you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. If you're limited to online connection though, not a problem. Just be sure to check out our website for at-home worship resources. But in the description box of this video, you're going to find the link to our website. As well, you can always follow us on YouTube and like us on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to both so that you'll stay up to date on all the new content when it's posted. We have a variety of resources available to families and kids on both Facebook and YouTube, so if this is your first time joining us, or if you've been here before, we want to encourage you to go ahead and check that out, because our mission is to equip families for the conversations that they have together to learn and grow and follow Jesus. And if you want to touch base personally, then feel free to reach out. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can use the address below. So let's dive in and see what we're going to learn about today.
A number of years ago, there was a study of seniors, people who had lived quite a lot of life at that point, and they were asked, if there was anything that you would want to do differently about life, what would it be? Or, what advice would you suggest to people that are younger than you? And as they distilled all their answers together, they understood that there was a trend, and these three kind of bubbled to the surface. One of them was to take more risks. One of them was to give more thought to things, and then lastly, they also wanted to do more things that would outlast them, that would last beyond their lifetime. That's a pretty incredible list, right? And it's some awesome advice. And most times when I talk to people about things like this, oftentimes they're looking for something that would be like this magic bullet, a secret sauce, so to speak, that would hit all of this stuff with tremendous gusto. They could just do one thing that would just be that thing that would be their thing. Many, however, don't seem to realize that there are opportunities that are already set up for them. But that's something that the people in this study seem to have sorted out, that oftentimes we're waiting for this perfect opportunity to take more risks or to give more thought to things or to do more things that last, when all along the ones that have tremendous lasting value for us and for the people that are around us may actually just be passing us by. Those opportunities are disappearing even as we wait for what we think is going to be the perfect timing. And we all have questions when we start to think about subjects like this that relate to our meaning and to our purpose, and we all want to live fully engaged with a list like this, because when we think about living our purpose and having an impact in life, for those of us who follow Jesus, we want to allow God to work through us in a way that will make a difference. But there are some times we wonder, what things will outlast us? What will be left when I'm not? Today we're going to take some time to look at the life of Timothy. Now, Paul would write to this young pastor at least a couple of times that we have on record in 1st and 2nd Timothy. And Timothy was somebody that Paul saw as his personal protege. But he was in a difficult setting to serve in. It would have been difficult for anybody to serve in. And Timothy seemed at both letters to be wrestling with how to deal with some of these challenging situations. But his issue seems to be this young age and some of the situations that are causing him to question his impact. Timothy's life had really distinct marks of faith that started under the influence of his grandmother Lois and his mother Eunice. His mother Eunice was a Jewish woman in the community of Lystra, and Timothy's father was a Greek man in that community. We're not certain if he was still alive at the time that we hear about him, or if he was just somehow absent from their lives. Lois, who was Eunice's mother, she had come to follow Jesus too, as we'll see in the scripture, and scholars suspect Lois probably even lived with Eunice to help raise Timothy. And Paul points out their teaching and their influence had paved the way for Timothy to understand faith, to follow Jesus, and to grow as a leader in the faith community. But their scenario was far from ideal. I mean, they're raising Timothy in a situation where his father was at least like absent in faith, maybe altogether. They lived in a town that was known as a military outpost, which made it rather gruff because there was a constant cycle of people and just a rough kind of group of folks that were a part of that from time to time. And they also lived in this town that was known for their worship of many idols. And it wasn't really all that kind or open to people who had any interest in following Jesus. If you look in the book of Acts, Lystra is actually the city that got so stirred up against Paul that they took him outside of town and threw stones at him, leaving him there for dead. Now, at some point in Timothy's life, Paul identifies potential in him, and he brings Timothy into his group of traveling church planters, and he gets Timothy set up in a few churches along the way, including a stint in the church in Ephesus. And all these places that he went, Corinth and etc., and they all had their issues. Ephesus had these issues like racial division and spiritual immaturity, and this led to issues with morals and ethics and dysfunctional relationships and misplaced internal conflict. I mean, these are, high-level problems that the congregation is dealing with. Most times when we think about some of these kind of problems, we'd be interested in sending in some kind of pastoral, experienced expert, somebody who had the training and the background and the confidence to be able to address these convoluted problems with the church. Paul, on the other hand, sends Timothy. And as he sends him, he continues to encourage him. And that's what these letters are about. I mean, he gives him some counsel along the way as he's learning what it means to do some of these tough things. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12 says it this way: don't let anyone think less of you because you're young. Be an example for all the believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity. I mean, he points him back to the example that he is. And where did he get his example? In another letter, Paul reminds Timothy that the example that he's watched was that of his mother and his grandmother. And it's what influenced him to follow Jesus. And it's at the core of what is going to help him be able to be a part of making a difference where he's serving right now. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, Paul says this to him. He says, I remember your genuine faith, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I know that same faith continues strong in you. This is why I remind you to fan into flames the spiritual gift that God gave you when I laid my hands on you. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. So Paul is telling him, you can understand what to do next based on the fact that God has already built so much into your life. It's a life of faith that stood out and garnered respect with the wider community. It mirrored the faith of his mom and his grandma. I mean, it was faith that had opened the door for him to become part of Paul's entourage, his team that was traveling. It was faith that had helped Timothy to influence many people beyond his home city of Lystra, as they discovered what it meant to follow Jesus as a result of Timothy's influence. It was a faith that continued to be a catalyst for many others to discover who Jesus was. And so Paul tells him, he says, Timothy, you're equipped to make a difference right now. You've noticed this in life, and many of us are well aware of this reality that people that we hang around a lot, people that we spend a lot of time with, we tend to start to sound like them, or we tend to act like them. When I think about one extremely influential pastor that was part of my life that I worked with for quite a number of years, I sometimes realize in my day-to-day activities, oh, that is just like him. I'm still finding activities that I'm doing that are habits that are like his. There's sometimes things that come out of my mouth and I go, oh man, that's something like my dad would have said. Because we know that when you spend a lot of time with people, ultimately you do start to act like them. You start to sound like them. And maybe even get the statement like, you kind of remind me of them. And we know this because oftentimes we treat it with caution when it comes to our kids or teenagers or even young adults when we make counseling statements like, choose your friends wisely because they will influence your life. We call this, in our congregation, the Achu principle, that more is caught in life than is taught. It's something we recognize in so many different settings. And so Timothy here is being reminded that he has caught much more than what he realized from the time he had spent with his mom and grandma, from the times he was with Paul and with the rest of that crew that was traveling, planting churches. These were things that were part of his life that had prepared him for where he is right now. But sometimes I think a guy like Timothy probably is somebody we could identify with. I think he probably wrestled with a lot of the same issues that we may wrestle with. Maybe sometimes we think that there's some place off in the distance that we'll be able to make an impact. Maybe we'll do something that will really last someday, but we're just not quite ready yet. Maybe we think it's too early in our lives, or maybe we think it's too late for us to do anything like that. But for Timothy, again, his risk factor was his age. And so he seemed to think that he wasn't really ready for what God was leading him to do. It may have been kind of scratching on some other parts of Timothy's life, like maybe self-doubt or, overthinking or lack of clarity. Sometimes fear of failure or fear of change could have influenced him, but it's giving him cause to think, whatever it was, that there was a better time ahead in the future, and when he got to that time, then maybe he'd then be able to follow through on some of the things that God was asking him to do and Paul had assigned him to be part of. But Paul reminded him of what he already was aware of. You see, in the lives of people that he'd encountered, he was discovering and had discovered the consistency of daily life. That daily modeling of life that started with Timothy's mom and his grandmother and prepared him to understand the times and know what to do. Consistency is not perfection, really. I think it helps us to understand this long-term picture of life over a protracted period of time. It's not something that's done in a day. It doesn't happen in a day. It happens as the accumulation of our daily habits continue to build up over time. I love this particular quote. It says, life grows the more you invest. When it's done consistently, it grows best. I mean, in his family, the investments from his mom and grandma likely seem small, some days even insignificant, some days hopeless. If you've had children wandering around your house, you recognize that there are times when it doesn't feel like you're making much of an impact at all. And so, these are consistent, small impactful investments over time. It started in their teaching and in their life and their attitudes and all of the way that they approach things. And as they allowed God to continue to work in them, it influenced Timothy. And God had been building this into Timothy through all these influencers. They were what he had needed then to continue to grow in him for what he needed to do right now. When I think about consistency, I think about the life of my grandfather, Mackenzie. My grandmother passed away at a very early age, and so my grandfather would often come by himself to visit our house after she was gone. And there were years and years that he had worked in his career in a building that had a significant amount of noise to it. And all of the people who had worked in that building without hearing protection, they ended up with difficulty with hearing in their later lives. And so What this did is it created an opportunity that sounds a little vulturish, but I would sit outside his room after he had gone to bed and listen to him pray. And he thought he was whispering, but he was whispering really, really loud. And I'd hear him pray for people, and I'd hear him pray for me. And his prayers were just like him, not fancy, just real. And it was such a great influence on my walk with Jesus. His steady, consistent, just very real approach to faith. There's more significant investment than we could ever realize that happens simply from being consistent. Now, Timothy, in the position that he's in right there, he'd also kind of picked up on some of these folks and these influencers in his life and how they had been intentional as well. Their intentionality in his life had actually been something he had caught along the way, and it was preparing him and prepared him for what he needed to do right then as well. I mean, looking back, he could see and probably remember how his mom and his grandma and Paul and other church planters along the way, they did their things on purpose. They weren't just people that had good intentions or good ideas that never kind of came to reality. They followed through on their good intentions to make action happen. And sometimes we wonder if time is just going to magically appear that we're going to be able to do the things that are our good ideas or our good intentions. But in Timothy's life, they chose to focus on, in his early years, some scripture discovery, and that took planning, and that took time, and that took attention to detail, and it took follow through. And it likely cost them something along the way as well. And so this is kind of for all of us, intentionality is where the plans and dreams inside our head move from good ideas and good intentions to actual reality. And if we're waiting for some magic moment for, the investments we make to just kind of pay off, or, we wonder if sometimes we complicate things because we're looking, for this sign, so to speak, whether it's a voice from above or the movie music starting or the cue, the plot twist. It's some kind of moment like that. It's like, if we share with people and we kind of step back as if they should really be impressed that this will make the difference. And then we sometimes get frustrated because we don't seem to immediately see the change that we expect should happen in people around us. When it comes to intentionality, I think about how when our kids were small, we had this conversation. And Val and I were kind of talking about how we wanted to allow our kids to experience a global mission experience at some point in their lives. And it would be great if it could be with us. And so as they're growing and getting into their 10th year of life and 11th year of life, and we're kind of sorting out, how is all this going to work? I mean, what do we do? Where do we go? How will we pay for it? I mean, what's the purpose of this? What's the plan to help it to happen? And we moved toward a plan, and it was very much on purpose that we committed ourselves and planned out the details so that when they were 14 years of age and around that area of life, that I would end up taking them on some kind of an international mission experience together, one-on-one. It was fun for me to see how their vision of the world expanded, and for them to return and tell the rest of the family about it, and how these other followers of Jesus started to get added to their lives, the courage that started to build in them. And I'm not sure how any of those moments would have just happened by accident. And they're treasured moments in my life, and I believe in theirs as well. And so, if we'd waited for something to magically appear as they became 14, I think all those ideas we had and the good plans would have just stayed as good intentions. Because we all know what it takes for an idea to actually move from idea to reality. It takes a lot of work. And sometimes it's easier for them to just stay ideas. But it takes intentionality for us to move them from idea to action. And when it comes to investing in Timothy, like Eunice, Lois, Paul, and all that entourage that were with him wherever he went, I mean, purposeful, active participation in following through on good intentions was something that he had witnessed quite a bit in his life. Timothy didn't even realize he'd learned what he'd learned and how it had prepared him for what he was currently facing. We can also see these influencers and how they helped him live out a life of humility. Now, humility is a word that gets tossed around quite a bit, but even so, it is full of so much meaning. I chose to kind of hunt for something that kind of encapsulated this, and this particular quote really stood out to me in the definitions subject of humility. Humility is an attitude of spiritual modesty that comes from understanding our place in the larger order of things. It entails not taking our desires, our successes, or failings too seriously. Now, it's possible, people like Eunice and Lois, maybe they had some ambitions of their own. The folks with Paul, they probably had a lot of other places that they could have chosen to be in life. I'm sure they wondered on some days if what they were doing even really mattered, but in God's larger order of life, they were incredibly significant in providing this foundation and a path of discovery for not only Timothy, but so many others to grow in faith and leadership. And in humility, they seemed to understand what their job was, to become shoulders that someone could stand on. Now, that kind of investment requires humility to realize that we're here on this earth for a very brief time, and it's actually people who will be our legacy in life. Imagine for just a couple of minutes if you could contact trace all the people that Timothy connected with in his lifetime, and even beyond in the indirect impact that people beyond that a couple of generations after would have had. Now, if you think about it, all of that points back to Eunice and Lois and Paul and his entourage. Sometimes investing in people can mean that their impact could become wider and greater and even more famous than some of ours. And that's what happened for many of these folks that we're talking about in Timothy's life. But we know Timothy was standing on the shoulders of these people everywhere he went. That consistent, intentional influence, rooted in humility, prepared Timothy to be far better ready to do what he needed to do than he realized. And this is what Paul is helping point out to him. The situation seems larger than you, but God's brought you this far and prepared you for what you're facing. And you can still make a difference now because God is going to take you the distance here. So it's kind of cool to see how everything Timothy needed to do and that God was asking of him, it had already been given to him. God had built it into Timothy through some of the influencers in his life. He had caught it over a long period of time. And we can't look at Timothy and overlook the influence of these people preparing him to do what needed to be done. I'd like to suggest that, that some of the things that God may be nudging us to be part of, whether it's crossing the line of faith or to step up in one of the settings where we live or work or play or learn, or in something in all of them, or to open a conversation about moving some of our good intentions into action. I mean, some of those things, someday we may look back on and wish we'd kind of taken the step to do more often. But I think the lesson here in Timothy's life is God's already equipped us to make a difference right now. And sometimes, like Timothy, we're looking out and all we can see is that one thing in the way. But for us today, the questions become like, what is the risk that we need to take? What's the thought that we need to give? What's the activity that we need to consider as it relates to investing in people? Because our lives too can build consistent and intentional and humility-driven action that can yield an impact that will outlast us. It's not even something that we always get to see in our lifetime, but just like these influencers, we don't control the impact, we control the investment. It's a statement that I've made before. It's not original with me, but it's a statement that says it's not our job to fill everyone else up, just to empty ourselves out. And to be clear, this is not a call to become this empty emotional and spiritual puddle on the floor, right? It's to serve all we can, when we can, and to whom we can. Now, imagine for just a couple of moments what would be possible if by faith we actually started to see each day as a purposeful opportunity to make investments of faith in people. Maybe some of our family, some of our neighbors, some of our friends, some of the people we work with. What would it look like in some of those settings if we started to serve them in a way that we were emptying ourselves out? Because if we understand what we've discovered in Timothy's life, God has already equipped us to make a difference in their lives right now. There's not some magical day we have to wait for. It's not, some idle call to say, that's cool though, either. Because the advice and the longing that we heard about these folks talking about, to take the risk, to give the thought, to do the things that will last, it's a response of action. So what will we do? Let me pray for us today. Father, I just want to thank you for the fact that you have equipped us for everything that we need to do right now. And so, whether it's learning that we've had through the influence of other people's lives, or whether it's something that you've invested in us, whatever it may be, God, I pray that the humble, intentional, consistent life that you are calling us to live and move from idle ideas to action would be something that you would help us to see what that looks like. It may involve some risks. It may involve giving some thought to some things, or it may involve, making some investments in people that will actually outlast us. Whatever that looks like, God, I pray that you'd help us not to kind of just see the one thing that we feel like is sometimes in the way. And God, I pray that you'd help us to understand from Timothy that there are people that have invested in our lives over years, and you've prepared us for this moment today. So I pray that you'd help us to act. In your name I pray. Amen.
Thanks again for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels, or if you're watching this on Facebook, then you can like and follow us there. And it would mean so much to us if you took a moment to comment, like, and share this video so that others are able to enjoy it as well. And hey, if you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. Please know, though, that you are loved and that we're praying for you. And we certainly appreciate your prayers, too. We'll see you soon.